learning the different technologies, all the different platforms that exist. Well, very glad to have you here. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Nicole Turner Lee to the series on COVID-19, politics and policy. We're very excited to have you here today. Dr. Turner Lee is a senior fellow in governance studies and director of the Center for Technology Innovation. She also currently serves as co-editor-in-chief of Tech Tank, and does a lot of different research and very interesting research on the intersectionality of equity and technology across the United States, and has done some very recent interesting work looking at regulation around telehealth and the implications that that's going to have on COVID-19 going forward. This series is really focused on the politics and policy of COVID-19, and we are now starting to make that transition from politics to policy, and we're very excited to have you here, Dr. Turner Lee. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
No, thank you, Eric, for having me, and I apologize for, again, being tardy. I was trying to figure out which way to get into this because we haven't used WebEx often. Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here. You're experiencing me on casual Mondays because normally I actually write. I have a book coming out, so today is transcript day. As I rush to get my book to the publisher. I'm Dr. Nicole Turner Lee. As Eric has said, I focus on technology. Everything related to technology and policy, whether legislative or regulatory, is the area in which I work. And the book that I'm actually writing is around the U.S. digital divide. It's called Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. So, quick thing, Eric, I hear a lot of feedback. Just try to, if everybody can kind of mute.
Oh, yeah, I'll mute all, and then if you want to unmute yourself.
In terms of technology and COVID-19. So let me just sort of give you an overview of what I've been working on in the last 7 months. And a lot of my work is still focused on the digital divide. So before the pandemic hit 7 months ago, we had a digital divide. It was about 18 million in counting in terms of people who were not online. They were disproportionately people of color. They were older Americans. They were foreign born. They were people with less than a high school diploma, low income, basically people on the other side of economic opportunity, right? So we already knew that we had marginalized populations that were essentially not online. And those marginalized populations actually grew in number when the pandemic hit because we found out not only were they not online, but the overlay of the systemic inequalities in which they experienced made it even more difficult to partake in society. So, for example, when 50 million plus school kids were told to stay home, it wasn't so much that, this is going to be a big deal because teachers were ready. I think most of us were ready to do what we're doing today. But the challenge was that 18 million really was 15 to 16 million of the 50 million children who did not have either home broadband access or a device. So now they were home without access or a device, and 9 million of those kids didn't have either. So according to Common Sense Media, that number was exacerbated by students of color. And later, and I'm still working in this, which is why today is casual day for me. My Mondays have become my Fridays. Educators can't get online. So in places around the country where educators are also considered low income, that they can't even access technology. So what COVID did was to actually show people that we have digital disparities in this country. We have digital disparities that go much wider and deeper than whether or not people have a connection or not, whether they have a device or not, whether they're in a place where there's affordable broadband or infrastructure, like if you're in urban versus rural. We found that everybody was in the same boat. Without access to technology, you couldn't work, you couldn't learn, you couldn't even go to the doctor. And so here we are, 7 months out. I don't know about you. I'm a policy person, so I have to watch. Somebody said, looking at Twitter over the weekends is like looking at, work for school. Well, that's what I do. I'm in policy. So I had to follow Twitter this weekend. And we all know that the President of the United States and the First Lady have COVID, along with several others who attended that super spreader event. The interesting thing is that presidents use the technology to tell us how well he's getting, but 200,000 people died of this virus who did not have equitable access to health care, nor did they have equitable access to tools that actually would have kept them in touch with their families. I, as a digital technologist, was actually somewhat appalled, without being partisan, by the way, when I realized that there were families who didn't have connectivity to the extent to which when their parents or family members were in nursing homes or in hospitals, they couldn't even say goodbye. Because we found out later, anecdotally, that many families were using FaceTime or knocking on the windows or trying to get that last phone call. And in many cases, people couldn't even do that. But yet the president actually, did a live conference. But with that in mind, it shows you just how deep technology is in our society. And so what does that say in terms of the United States' inability to get people connected during COVID? And what does that suggest in terms of the technology being used to actually help us solve this problem? So let me just break it down into two parts, and then I'll be quiet, and Eric will sure have some questions as well as all of you. First and foremost, let's talk on the positive side. I mean, obviously, on the positive side, contact tracing through digital health applications is going to be enormous. The ability to have, and for those of you who do not understand technology, I'll give you a quick briefing. Basically, they're not going in and looking at your phone data. Apparently, what they're doing is they're picking up what's called beacons, and those beacons are pinging whether or not you're in proximity to someone who is diagnosed with the virus. So essentially, your beacon, if you voluntarily opt into this application, when you become infected, you will ping your beacon and say, I've become infected, and anybody whose phone was in a radius of your environment would then be pinged. Sounds great, and I actually think it's a great idea to contain the type of public health surveillance that we need. But some of you may have looked at the news. In the state of Virginia, the app has been out for about 6 months or 3 months, and no one is using it. And so on the positive side, we do have technology that can help us with contact tracing. We have technology that can help us right now with the California wildfires and the people who are being displaced there. We have technology that can help the people who were displaced under COVID who were filing for unemployment. So there are positive uses. I don't want anybody to leave this conversation to say technology is all bad. But on the other side of it, the implications of not being connected pretty much have three implications. One, it speaks to the lack of infrastructure in our society. Doesn't matter if you're in rural and you don't have broadband access. In my book, I actually traveled to 7 places across the country to ask people about their broadband access because a lot of my book is qualitative. In rural America, there is absence of digital technology, and there are so many people who are impoverished that make it even more difficult. So one place that I went to in Garrett County, Maryland, they said they don't even have Uber because people don't have credit cards and they don't have cars. So they're definitely excluded if you don't have the infrastructure to be connected. That's the first thing. You don't have the opportunity to be connected if you can't afford it. So whereas in rural, it may be infrastructure, in urban areas, it's the affordability. So people somehow think that just because you live in an urban area that you're fully connected. That's not always the case. There's often a lack of competition in very highly impoverished census tract areas. In addition to that, many of us don't realize that poor people run out of data midstream in the month. And as a result, they cannot apply for unemployment, nor can they tap into their healthcare provider. We saw, for example, when it came to the first two parts, infrastructure as well as affordability, the fact that we had people who could no longer go into a distressed hospital or to their doctor. So they had to use what was called telehealth. Telehealth is your ability to remotely and access your medical practitioner in hopes of getting some type of care or diagnosis or preventative well-being care. I wrote a paper about this a couple of weeks ago. Prior to the pandemic, we did not permit telehealth. Now with the pandemic, it is widely accepted. And in fact, I just wrote something about hoping that we can make it permanent. Because what that does on the positive side, it levels the playing field because you don't necessarily have to go into a doctor, but you also have access to primary care, secondary care, tertiary care. What I mean by that. So I did a telehealth visit just recently, actually the beginning of the pandemic, where I needed to re-up a prescription. And I need to see the doctor first. So I got on my phone. He saw me. I saw him. We had a conversation. He didn't check my vitals, but he went through a verbal checking of my vitals. I got my prescription done. My mother, she has MDS, which is a rare disease. She normally would go into a New York City hospital to get her blood taken and to actually have a conversation with her doctor. She still had to continue to get her blood taken, but she had to go less often because now through telehealth, once she figured out how to turn her camera around so it wasn't talking to the wall, she was able to talk to her doctor. These instances that I'm sharing are actually positive use cases for technology during COVID, where people are going to go through the type of rapid testing needs and be symptomatic or asymptomatic and need to talk to a medical health professional. It's also helpful for the thousands, if not millions of people who had to put general care on hold, those with chronic disease, etc. But one thing we know about this virus, and then I'll end up with the last third point. I'm like a preacher. I only give you 3 points and then I keep it moving, is that African Americans and Latinos were highly susceptible and more likely to die. And so you already had, going back to my first point, people of color who were already enwrapped in the systemic inequalities of lack of access to health care because of, the racial inequalities I forgot to mention that was creating the mental health trauma that communities of color have been experiencing over these last decades, if not, years since we've been here. But in the recent months, this has been played over and over and over again. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery. What I say to you all is, COVID is killing us, and the mental health is actually close to killing us. And if you look at that and you don't have a cell phone or you don't have broadband access, you can't benefit from telehealth. And so even in communities that have high rates of health disparities that need to get to a doctor because of pre-existing chronic condition, they often don't have broadband access or they can't afford it if they're in urban. So again, a missed opportunity that actually exacerbates the digital divide. And then finally, I would say this as a policymaker. We now are at this state 7 months in. Kids still aren't really back to school. People are still dying. Healthcare is still inadequate. Employment is still sporadic in terms of your ability to be a frontline worker and work at home. I don't know if some of you saw this. I'm a big technology wonk, Eric, so if I give you stats. Amazon had 20,000 people infected in their warehouse at the beginning of the pandemic. So those people had to go to work. They were not necessarily online like we are today. So COVID has had some impact that's going to be long lasting. And so my third point is, once we deal with infrastructure, once we deal with affordability, there's a host of other issues we have to deal with. Privacy being one of them. What's going to happen to all this data that's been collected on all of us? How is that going to impact, for example, African Americans who are likely to be affected by coronavirus getting health insurance in the next 6 to 7 months? How will surveillance of our public health status, of our communities, actually impact our safety in this, during COVID state? But I would say this as I end. The train has left the station and the digital new normal is here. We are going to be in this state, my friends, right now where being connected matters. And it matters for a host of reasons, whether it's healthcare, education, whether it's employment, whether it's the ability to speak to family and friends, whether it's doing what we're doing now. And I implore all of you, as you think about this and you come up with questions, to think about things that you probably have heard. Should broadband be a public utility? Is it a universal right? Should we be thinking about technology much like we think about rural electricity? Is this something that we should see the permanence of virtual education or telehealth? How do we come out of this with digital still being the new normal? Because our industries have now closed. 100,000 businesses have closed in the 7 months that will permanently never come back. If you're a movie buff like me, you will not get to see the James Bond movie this year. Regal is closing. We're going to have to wait till 2021. And so when you think about all these things, the new digital normal has arrived. And so in my work, that's all I do is spend my time there, trying to figure out how do I bring normalcy back to low-income people who are already not within a normal state of affairs, who are already on the wrong side of digital opportunity, and who are already really facing a lack of voice within the public square of this online economy. And I would just, again, implore all of you to think about the platforms that we use that have become much more dominant and the networks that we're dependent upon that are essentially driving the quality of life for millions of people who are not us. So I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the very important work that you do. I'm going to open it up to questions, but as I usually do, I'll kind of lead off with one. What's pretty fascinating to me is actually seeing a little bit of intersection between some of the things that I study and what you're suggesting here, which, I often think about, and I study economic development, community development, economic equity. And one of the areas that actually shows some promise in terms of economic growth has been broadband and access to the internet. And I'm curious as to what your take is on, what would be the potential benefit in expanding, ensuring that everyone had access to internet, both in terms of economic growth, but, longer term consequences of actually expanding.
Yeah, I love what you're studying. So we gotta compare notes after this, right? Because clearly there's an economic benefit to broadband access. Countries like China have already figured that out, which is why they're accelerating artificial intelligence systems as well as 5G, right? Look at how you're shopping today. You don't go into Giant anymore. You use Instacart. I was looking at this article over the weekend. There's this woman on LinkedIn who shares how many online purchases she's made through Amazon and what they have been. The new normal is going to require an economic infusion of capital into these new economies. And we're seeing some of the friction as a result of these economies sort of dominating the marketplace. Look at what's happening right now to Uber and Lyft drivers, who are now, the desire is under a Biden-Harris administration to actually make them into independent contractors or give them benefits, because now it's sort of legitimizing this new digital economy. So I would say yes to all of that. But I would caution us to think that it's so rosy, though, just on technology. Black startups and Latina startups still do not get access to capital, despite digital becoming very much ubiquitous. There's a great article that was just put out by a friend of mine, Cheryl Dorsey, who basically suggests that, in fact, dips in venture capital funding for startups, particularly startups founded by people of color, down. We're also seeing, I think this, if you have been watching the legislative hearings of late, there was one last week and one 2 weeks before, we're also seeing a lot of dominance in the marketplace by 5 or 6 companies. And a lot of concern of these 5 or 6 companies are basically pushing out small providers. So who's going to be Amazon with a lower A? You can't because they're not letting you in the marketplace. So I think there's a trade-off on both sides. The extent to which we look at this digital opportunity, but we also look at the digital risk and digital cost. If you begin to also look at the new commodity of the 21st century is your data. What people collect on you is actually market-based and commoditized to the point that it can help new companies grow and expand. And it can also, mess up your credit or deny you loans or deny your ability to actually compete in this economy. I focus a lot of stuff, my research is also on algorithmic bias, where we find out that even though we've litigated the civil rights laws of fair credit and fair housing, there are still algorithms that can kind of bypass that. And they can make determinations on whether or not you're credit worthy or your house ready in terms of mortgages and loans. So it's sort of almost amplifying and redoing the stereotypes that were previously litigated. So Eric, I think to your point, I think that this is this conversation around the future of industries, as well as how do we balance what's happening now. I'll give you another good example. So with schools being out, it's not so much that there's a digital divide anymore in the last 7 months. We're now facing an achievement gap. Black kids who stay out of school any more time, like connected to formal learning, will be behind 10.3 months in educational retention, according to a McKinsey study. Low-income kids a year. So the companies you talk about, Eric, that people can go into, we ain't gonna be ready because kids will not be adequately trained for those positions. I have a 13-year-old, and I can't tell you how many times I walk into her room and she just looks like she has a deer in the headlight look. And I can't even help her because I don't even know what she's working on because I'm down here on the Zoom. And so I think going forward, the promise of digital that we always prescribe to is being challenged. That normative understanding of what digital look like will potentially be challenged if we don't figure out how to deal with these big issues of marketplace competition and domination, platform domination, algorithmic bias, as well as the workforce and training of future generations to take on these roles. I think I think we're steering in a direction where I just got a note today that in London, I think it is, they've developed an algorithm to tell you where people are being evicted in low income housing so they can gentrify quicker. So this is, as a sociologist, this is what's happening to technology. It's becoming very pernicious. And I think the perils of technology are going to show up, which is why my book is called Why the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. Because as much as I like to say it's an equalizer and it's a great opportunity, it has its challenges. On the last part, in terms of everybody having, I completely agree that we need to ubiquitously deploy technology. It needs to be universal. The challenge that we have in this country, though, and this is for everybody who's listening, is that technology infrastructure has always been privately funded. And so the model itself actually requires private investment. And the reason we're not completely built out is because it's been a formula-based model based on their return on investment. And so you've got to ask yourself now, particularly in governments that are strapped with cash, the extent to which a government can actually become an internet service provider, not just providing the network, but the customer service and the maintenance. So that's something for me. I mean, I personally am not a huge fan of government sponsored networks because I think it does two things. One, if you look at Flint and the handling of your water, it suggests that there might be some abuse of some sort. Or if we think about all the things that we do on the internet, I don't think we want government telling poor people you only have this much amount of minutes to do X. So I'm still trying to figure out what that looks like. But I do think there's an opportunity for government and private sector to come together or to find ways to be technology agnostic so that cities that I visited, for example, where there's 500 people and 2,000 cows, a local broadband provider can actually provide service within a mainstream funding, environment, as opposed to sort of self-funding it, which is a lot of the examples that I saw across the country. So yeah, Eric, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I if you would have called me 7 months ago, I think I would have had something different to say. But right now, I am literally exhausted by the fact that technology has really changed the scope of all of these things that we thought were going to be the dominant, attributes of a technological society.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I mean, you just hit on so many really fascinating points. I do want to open it up to others in the audience to ask any questions.
I see you. I know you have questions out there.
Hi, I've got a couple, but I'll just ask one first. So I am an essential employee, and the business next to us is a Starbucks. And watching I mean, obviously forever, people have done their work when their education at that Starbucks because it's a gathering place. But I'm curious, well, I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but it's definitely something interesting to think about in the sense that now there are people who are doing their college educations, mostly seems like they're college aged. I don't see like kids there doing their elementary school stuff with the Wi-Fi there, but obviously they're there to use the Wi-Fi and to have coffee. But I always feel for the people who work at the Starbucks because they are increasing their kind of exposure because people are staying and they're allowed to be inside the store, which is and sit with a mask off and work. And I can totally, like, it's competing interests because you obviously want people to be able to do their work or their education remotely and have access to the Wi-Fi. But I also feel for the people who work at Starbucks.
And I love your question. Yep.
And I mean, I guess I know the other part of this is that there's an organization in the city, and the name is escaping me. I live here in Baltimore City, who are pressuring Comcast and Xfinity to provide more hotspot coverage. And I think they have done some. I don't want to commit because I've only heard about it on the radio, and I haven't researched it more fully. But it does seem like an easy temporary solution to the problem to try to provide as much Wi-Fi coverage in the city, which is not an enormous, I mean, it's big, but you could cover neighborhoods with Wi-Fi. I mean, it wouldn't be the Second World War, you could do it. And I'm curious what you think about those kinds of plans.
No, I mean, I love it. And so it's so funny that you say I live in Virginia. And so I go to Starbucks, and I'm actually curious because it used to be like nobody could be inside. Now they could be inside. I did notice that the other day, people not with masks. Makes me want to go to the Starbucks in Giant now, because I'm like, oh my goodness, all these people walking around. So there's two things. One, I want to direct everybody to a recent blog that I wrote around. It was related to schools, but it's very much on point with what Quinlan is talking about, which was about communities becoming partners to local schools and providing more Wi-Fi open access. So to your point, I think it's interesting around this conversation. Well, why aren't cities fully Wi-Fi? What happened? I think, first of all, you got to go back to what I said. Private investment, basically, prior to the pandemic, drove build out. And so there were Wi-Fi in many cities, but guess where they were? At the beachfront, at the national park, right? Any place where there was a tourist drive, you actually saw Wi-Fi. Then came Starbucks, and local cafes provided some type of input. Libraries became a place for Wi-Fi. Generally within the library. Schools before the pandemic were places of Wi-Fi for folks who literally sat on digital stoops or stoops to actually access the free Wi-Fi. In some cases, you might have heard this term digital parking lots, where people pull up to the school or the library because they've gotten permission to extend their signal out to the parking lot of the building, adjacent to the building. But all of these take money, and they also take some type of cooperation or agreement around the spectrum bands being used. And so what people don't understand when you look at commercial wireless, let's just say commercial broadband, for example, company like Comcast may have a fixed broadband connection into the home and essentially be able to offload into Wi-Fi hotspots. In some cases, Quinlan, that band is pretty much free and open. It's a very slither of a band. In some cases, you have to pay. And so when you're in Starbucks, for example, you're constantly bouncing around networks to get to the free stuff. So it's like going in I try to tell people, it's like going into the parking lot of a mall where you're looking for a space and you eventually find a space and you're like set and it's all good, right? But every once in a while, you may ride around that parking lot for a while to get some type of connectivity. And so to your point, you can't wire everything because, one, policymakers have not allowed for that type of provision of non-commercial companies to do so. So right now, for example, with schools and libraries, we're in the middle of a big, big debate as to the purpose of their connectivity was to the school, to the classroom, and to the library building, and not to the home or to the community. And so I wrote in this blog, with all this vacant space that we have created from this virus with regards to office equipment and buildings, we haven't thought about bringing a small cohort of kids, for example, or some of these working folks that have to work within neighborhoods into unoccupied space. I live in Alexandria, in Kingstown, the area where I'm near. We've lost 7 businesses in the suburban area. It's like interesting, like these were thriving businesses that are now vacant. And yet we still can't provide ubiquitous Wi-Fi, Quinlan, to your point. And these places also have some office equipment that we could be giving to kids or giving to students to get online to go to school. As part of my conversation. We still are stuck on digital parking lots. That I did an NBC News segment where this woman had 6 kids in the back of her car and was literally going from what I actually proposed at the beginning of the pandemic, Wi-Fi enabled school buses to tap into their Wi-Fi for schoolwork. But she had 6 kids in the car. 6, not 3, not 1, 6 kids. And after 7 months, that appears to be very dehumanizing. So I'm proposing, Quinlan, to your point, how about we actually take those digital parking lots and make them into digital parks? How about we put some benches outside? How about we tap into the Wi-Fi that the city can generate so that people could sit out within their local communities and do their homework or, figure out ways to communicate with their family or friends. Teachers could actually do their lesson plans with a sustainable broadband solution, or a frontline worker could actually go out there and do telehealth. That's the first thing. The other reason why it's a little harder just to do one big old Wi-Fi hotspot is because of privacy. These are oftentimes unsecured networks, and people don't necessarily do their medical care stuff over unsecured networks or their banking and stuff like that. So what we found, for example, in schools is that they don't know what kids have at home. So they've been giving them these Wi-Fi hotspots, but they've also given them computers in some instances because they can firewall it. I had a really great anecdote that happened the other day where a mother is using her kid's Chromebook because she has to tap into work. So could you imagine what that looks like in that household? So, I mean, I think it's just not an easy scenario, Quinlan. And in some places, the law has basically foreclosed on states to actually build municipal broadband networks. So they have to be tied to the franchise laws so that they can only build, only private sector can build. So you have the $1 million question that we are all trying to answer right now. How do you create much more open source access that is still safe and secure and readily available to all? And then how do you build it in a way that somebody has the right device to actually get onto that network, which is a whole nother area. Now you all see why I continuously stay working because this has been such a big issue in terms of just trying. I mean, digital has been around so long, my friends, and it's always been 10th. And now it's like number 1. And we've always known for a few of us that there's been a digital divide. So I hope I've answered your question. I mean, I think we would like it to be much easier, but there are regulatory barriers, there are legislative barriers, there's statewide controls, there's the private sector piece of it, and then there's the spectrum scarcity, like I mentioned, where we probably don't have enough spectrum, the broadcast waves that allow us to get online with our phones and our tablets to not have the type of interference that you're talking about. But I do want to say, just before I close with your question, that for low-income kids and marginalized kids that need to get online, whether it's a student or remote workers, we need to do something. And that's why I've suggested in this article, put some benches out in local open spaces, revitalize those open spaces for people to humanly engage broadband, open up some of these unused office buildings and stores that are now vacant and create co-working spaces that now can allow people to social distance. And then to your point, find ways to get companies to provide more Wi-Fi hotspots or open Wi-Fi hotspots to non-customers, because that's the other thing. Oftentimes you have to be a customer to get access to that hotspot, and that's not happening. And then in terms of those Starbucks workers, pray, because somehow we got to still get our coffee during a pandemic, and they're there working, and from what I've seen, they've all exercised the right public safety measures, but I think we're taking a little bit too far if we think that we've gone back to normal and people should be sitting in a closed space without a mask doing work. That's why I said I think we've got to find ways to push people out, but have them get great connectivity so that they can do that. We've done it with restaurants. I don't know why we can't do that in certain other cases.
And great question, Quinlan. I saw another question come in about technology-based payments. And, obviously this is an increasing area where we're seeing a lot of different ways to pay for services or goods using technology. But, part of the question is about implications of that on low-income individuals, immigrants, or people without housing who might not have access, obviously to some of those technologies. I don't know if you have some thoughts there.
I mean, it's true. I mean, I don't know how many people had access to Chops, the salad place. Like, I think the one near my job in DC decided they were not doing cash payments. Now, not suggesting that people were coming all the way down to DuPont Circle to get a salad, right? But that was like, for me, a high sign that going into a cashless economy without the collateral that people need to compete is a problem. So in my book, I actually write about that. I think like the new digital scare is the fact that people think that everybody can get an Uber, everybody can get an Airbnb, everybody can do DoorDash, everybody can do Uber Eats, but you can't do those things without a credit card or a banking account, right? And if you're already underbanked or you're unbanked, it's just highly improbable. I was one time, I'm a sociologist, so we take a lot of observational stuff. I was at a CVS at about 11:30 picking up a prescription maybe last year. And these kids came in, Black kids, and they were like looking for an Uber card. I didn't know they had an Uber card that you can prepay for an Uber. And they were cute because they were like, oh man, this CVS doesn't have it. We got to go to the next one, because they were obviously trying to get back home. To me, that again is almost as humiliating as the 6 kids in the car trying to access broadband. We've made broadband more ubiquitous because the price points are lower. You can get prepaid, you can get a phone that, has a certain amount of minutes, etc. But we've also, to the person's question, we made it even more difficult for people to participate. You cannot pay your bill if your phone is shut off without a credit card. And so, low-income people are running out getting gift cards. When I was doing my research in Stanton, Virginia, which is about 3 hours away from here, guy by the name of Joseph Mulgrave, who I write about in my book, third generation Stanton resident, black African-American male. He runs out of minutes halfway through the month, every month, and he's a day laborer, and he cannot get work for the rest of the month. I literally had a person who read my story. All this is on my website, drnicolespeaks.com, or at Brookings, just Nicole Turner Lee, no hyphen. I had a person who read my story about Stanton, which he was included, who said, I want to give this guy a laptop, because he had a child and a then girlfriend, and they had 2 kids, and they had shared with me how they have to go to their mother's house to use her Wi-Fi and then get off their cell phone minutes to hold their minutes for the rest of the month. And so a person had called and said, hey, I want to give this family a laptop. Can you find them? Now, when you're a researcher like myself and Eric, you don't really keep up with your respondents, right? So I felt it. I was on my way to Roanoke, and I decided to stop by and see if he still lived there, because I kind of went up to their house. His mother said, I don't know where he's at. I'll know by the first of the month because his phone is off. This is America. And this is how people are living. So to the person's question, the more that we enable technology-based payments without thinking about the implications of people being offline or not being able to do it because they don't have financial collateral, we do dismiss their experiences in the digital economy. Further, when low-income people do get online, I want to go back to the algorithmic discrimination, they often click and bait. 39% interest rate, get a loan for free at $25,000. Credit Karma is not Experian, my friends. It's not judging you against FICO. But yet, we have Black and Latina individuals who are credit challenged, who find themselves in a negative spiral of only getting high interest predatory offerings. So or they take advantage of things that I take advantage. I do have a kid in college. Cash App and Venmo. But those do not create wealth. They don't necessarily have to link to a bank account. They're transactional. And so I think as we go forward with technology, again, we need more people focusing on the digital disparities that exist that overlay with the systemic inequalities that we actually see. Same thing happens, I'll give you another good example because this is recent, with housing. Section 8 eligible residents tend to see Section 8 eligible households, which then leads them to being in concentrated poverty in the same types of housing, which, by the way, was one of the reasons why we saw Black and Latinas actually affected by the virus, because of the housing quality and the lack of access to proper health care and food. With that being said, if the algorithm is not showing you anything different except what they think you are, you'll never be able to break the trajectory of poverty. And that's at Brookings. I have to tell you, my friends, I don't know who I'm talking to out there that might be interested in this. We need more people talking about this, and we need more people researching and studying this, because these are such critical issues that I think will become the inflection point as this new technology goes into the 4th or 5th generation of whatever this is supposed to be, that we just don't have enough people that understand the sociological, economic, and political implications of new technologies and the data and the outputs that they generate.
Yeah, I certainly think it's pretty fascinating to think about the role of algorithms and artificial intelligence making these decisions when we know a lot of the information that gets fed into them had been biased to begin with, right? And it's only, they're only information in, right?
Right, because we're biased. Like, technology doesn't change our biases. We start out biased. So if you're a developer that grew up in a space where you didn't have exposure to different experiences, as my friend Dr. Faycott Payton from North Carolina State talks about, the lived experiences of the developer, that you, or let's say you go into technology, but you're a true scientist, but you don't understand that, there's an ethical implication of your work, or there's an implication around a sociological implication or political science implication. You're going to develop, because the technology marketplace is all about break it now and fix it later. And breaking it now, unfortunately, suppresses the vote of millions of people, make sure people do not have the health care that they deserve, and it places predatory financial services or lack of employment opportunities on people that don't even know that this is happening to them. And so I think that these are such important implications because, as you said in your work, this is where technology is going. This is the new wave. This is a new next generation of technology. And so I think we need to pay attention to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's quite clear that people don't realize how much, free information they're giving to a lot of these companies that have market value, right? So let me see if there's any additional questions.
Can I say something, Eric, real quick?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I think it's worth people understanding this. Part of the challenge that we have in the United States when it comes to any of these guardrails is because we did develop an internet under Clinton-Gore administration that was a reciprocity model. You give me your information, and in return, I give you free services. So prior to Facebook and Instagram, when we were just dealing with AOL, which is simple email, leading into Google or Mozilla and Firefox and Google, we were basically in this exchange where my content basically, drove the design and development and expansion of these new models. Now we're at a state where the social contract between most people and their social media platform is unknown. We think that, as in Cambridge Analytica, that we put up our information and our profile pictures and our friends, and we don't understand two things. One, that's actually being scraped for the purposes of advertisement. So Facebook, as much as I use it, is nothing but an optimized marketing platform. So the more data that you give, the better targeting that advertisers can actually do. It's as I heard of the social, what was it? The new film that everybody told me to watch, The Social Dilemma, when they talk about, their advertising is just allow advertisers like their glorious dream to be able to get to the granular level of a person. So that's good. And I don't know about you all, but I do like it when I get recommended certain movies or certain hair products or certain boots, because I'm a big avid shoe shopper. But it's not good when that same information can be turned around and my affinities, likes, actually stirs towards what we call deep learning to neurologically change my position about candidates or dissuade me from not joining a white supremacist group, or has me sort of locked into my own affinity group in ways that could be harmful. And I think that's the part where we actually don't know those things. And I share with people, and I'll share with your group. It's like being on social media is like being on a playground. There are some people who are on the monkey bars. There are some people who are on the swings. There are some people who are going down the slide. And there are some people playing in the sandbox. The difference is the white supremacists might be on the springs. The Black Lives Matter people might be on the slide. The lifestyle enthusiasts will be in the sandbox. And you don't know that any of these people exist because your own likes, affinity groups never show those people in the same playground. And that's the part of my research I find to be so interesting because, again, that's where you get disinformation and misinformation and amplification of algorithms and people having that groundswell of fear and, angst around certain things. And I think that's where it's manipulative. And that's where we see legislators trying to figure out, well, where do we regulate these companies? Which I think going forward, we actually might see that in a new administration.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And I think the regulation piece is pretty fascinating too. When you think about, governmental actors who might not have the same level of knowledge as a lot of these companies on the technology side, what the implications are for the types of regulations that we see. So, but let me see if there's any additional questions.
Hello.
Yep, I can hear you.
So my question is regarding the apps for contact tracing. Has there been any successful apps, or has there just not been enough will from I guess local state official or even the federal government to push or encourage people using the apps, or is there just laws within the app because this virus is just different from pretty much what we've ever experienced before in America?
So I think it's interesting. I love your question. I mean, contact tracing apps actually worked in Korea and China and other places, but those countries had higher surveillance outside of the virus. So it was expected. I go to China often, and they have 800,000 plus cameras that actually surveil you throughout a day. And so it was sort of expected that if you had a contact tracing app, that you would actually have to adopt it because the Chinese government sort of mandated that. Here in the United States, it's more voluntary, right? Contact tracing has typically been more telephone-oriented, physical tracing. Contact tracing in this public health crisis is also more daunting because you have such an over subscription of certain populations who already distrust healthcare, so they're not going to answer the phone. I actually had a couple people die from COVID from New York, and then I've had friends of color who've been medically challenged that have it. And I remember talking to one of the mothers of one of my friends. She said, I was not answering my phone when it said, the healthcare people, and she called her doctor, but I'm like, but you have to call because right now, that's the only way we can mitigate the risk of this virus. But I see Quinlan put, it's not optional. That's the problem. People think it is because, again, the commercial sector has introduced it in a way where people have to opt into the application to be able to, again, get that digital health beacon or that beacon to hit you if you've been in close proximity to somebody. Think about the contact tracing that's going to go on with the president. No one probably downloaded that app. So we're in more trouble because we have no idea who was actually part of the network of people who were actually infected as part of the surveillance. Yes, it's not optional in South Korea and China. You're right about that. But I think that we're going to see, it's interesting. The DMV has put together this mobility consortium to actually contact trace better because here in the DMV, we go between Maryland, DC, and Virginia. So they're hoping that people will actually have an uptake of the contact tracing so that when we are driving to work, right, we live in Virginia, we drive to Maryland or we're this, so we could actually have a better hold on it. But I would urge all of you to look at Virginia. I think the statistic is 500,000 people in Virginia, probably less than a third, have actually opted for the digital health tool. And Apple has done a really good job with Google of ensuring differential privacy so that it doesn't track back to somebody's phone. So, I think there, Josh, I don't think we're going to adopt it the way we should. I think that if it's okay with you all, I'll just tell you as a policymaker what I think is going on. This disease has become so politicized that it's going to make it harder to get people to take on contact tracing. We can't get people to take on masks. I don't think we're going to get people to take on a digital health application that would surveil their health. That's the first thing. Two, even though people know it's just really for you to get a ping if you've been exposed to somebody in the grocery or at the mall, very randomized, it still has implications of who collects that data and where does it go. And so there are some fears by populations, like if I, going back to what Quinlan said of being an essential worker, if I have the disease, right, or I have the virus and now it's known, I can't go to work. So what does that mean in terms of 6 months down the line when I'm denied health insurance or my job is trying to clear the roster of people who are COVID infected? And so, it's a really tough thing. And I also think the third reason why we've not seen huge adoption in this country is that people just want to be tested and they can't get tested. So they definitely aren't going to contact trace until they know that it goes hand in hand. And unfortunately, we still don't have rapid testing available in all places. We still have it. It's my son just went to college for freshman year. He had a home kit mailed to him. He mailed it back 12 o'clock in the morning before we were supposed to leave that day. He was told he couldn't come to school because his test was unreadable. We had to stand in line for 3 hours to get a rapid test so that we could get the test results on a piece of paper and he could get into school. It's been those botched efforts to sort of have a comprehensive strategy to testing that I think is making the contact tracing very hard to adopt. And I think the same thing, Josh, to your question, is going to happen too when it comes to the vaccine. I think we'll see several people not taking the vaccine seriously because they're not seeing a general framework for the management of the virus. But it helps. It does help. The HIV was completely public health surveilled and we had lower cases as a result. Today, I think people have such a distrust in technology that it's just harder to adopt among certain people because they just don't trust the technology is going to actually be fair.
Great, thank you. I think I saw a question come in, which asks, let's see. Now that the digital divide has been extensively covered and brought to the forefront as a political issue, do you think that the existing barriers to municipal broadband will be challenged? how effective do you think those challenges will be in the legal barriers in specific?
I love that question, Tom. Let me tell you why. Because there were lots of schools that were like, oh, we'll solve this problem. We'll just develop a mesh network and we'll work with the city and make sure that our kids are covered. And then they would get on the phone with me, because I've talked to a lot of superintendents, city council members, and say, we couldn't do it because of municipal broadband. They didn't even know what municipal broadband challenges were. And then they found out when they were trying to get the kids back online. So I think that's an interesting question. I mean, Chattanooga, which is probably one of the few existing municipal broadband networks, just approved a school network to get 48,000 kids online that are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. But they're rare. And I think, unfortunately, and I'll say it publicly, I think that there'll still be a land grab among private sector companies to get to these existing subscribers. And so I think wherever there is a challenge to municipal broadband that threatens an ISP, I think it will still be threatened. There are still laws in the book by certain ISPs in the state of Texas and other places that challenge municipal broadband. And you would think at this point, and this is what I actually talk about in my book, that we're just really in an all hands on deck moment where it doesn't matter. Like, because right now, 90% of the country is covered by any type of formal ISP. So why do we care about the last 10%? If they didn't want to build it then, they really are going to build it now, because it's still more cows than people, or it's not enough people that actually have the income to support a FiOS or something else. But I think what's going to happen in this digital divide, that it's going to actually bring some market opportunities that kind of Eric talked about in the cases of procurement. I mean, think about all the Wi-Fi hotspots that schools bought in one quarter. If you look at it, ISPs have not gone out of business. In fact, I give them credit because Cox, for example, just gave a $60 million commitment to close the digital divide. They follow a long stream of these companies that are giving millions, double-digit millions, to close the digital divide. But I also believe, based on their history, that they're doing it because it actually provides more subscribers. So they're finding additional market bases to tap into that eventually become subscribing customers of their networks. And until the United States actually treats broadband access, to this person's point around, it's not public utility, it's not just municipal broadband, it's a combination of a lot of things. But most importantly, it's the universal service that this country provides to people who cannot afford it. That's the main thing. And I think we still have a very outdated universal service program that doesn't treat broadband insecurities like food insecurities. And we still have broadband when it's all said and done. Look at the last debate. It wasn't even mentioned. And so we still have it at last at the list ideologically, which I think is dangerous because of the fact that we are going to need people to adapt to this new online economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will see if it does come up in any of the future debates, should they happen. Certainly, indeterminate at this point. So, well, I know we're pretty much at time. Please join me in thanking Dr. Nicole Turner Lee for such a wonderful job, and definitely appreciate all the work you do. And thanks for sharing it with us.
No, thank you for having me. Like I told people, this is my casual Mondays because this is the day that I usually do writing. So I appreciate that it was with all of you and not folks that didn't have great questions. And I appreciate you all listening, not necessarily to my rant, but to this narrative of what's actually happening to millions of people that are really not connected. So hopefully you will look at things differently and invite me back for my book, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my book.
Well, please let us know when it's published, and I'll send out a link to everyone. So,
and follow me on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter if you want to catch up with me. I'll put my link there, and you can also follow me on Brookings. Hold on, I'll tell that. But thank you. I enjoyed Eric this this type of conversation.
Yeah, it's really wonderful that we use technology to have speakers like yourself join us. So that has been one of the silver linings in all of this. So thank you again. All right, great.
Thank you.
And I'll be sure to pass that along as well.
Perfect. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks again. All right, everyone. Well, If you have any particular questions, feel free to reach out to me. But otherwise, thank you for joining. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Take care.